This is a game Evgeny Sveshnikov, which was played in 1978. So Evgeny Sveshnikov is pretty much the founder of the Sveshnikov variation in the Sicilian defense, and these days he has pretty much given up on this variation. But in 1978 he was one of the main players who played this variation, and Geller was one of the players who did not have faith in the structure of Black's position, and he had several games in which he tried to refute Sveshnikov's idea. So, of course, the opening went like this: the Sicilian defense, and we quickly transpose into the Sveshnikov variation, where Black has advanced the pawns in the center and has given to White this outpost on d5, but he's hoping to play around this outpost, and he's hoping to exploit the bad position of this knight on a3. And the following moves were pretty standard. White is trying to get the knight back into the game. Black wants to save the bishop from being exchanged on f6, and possibly he's also planning to trade off the knight on e3 when the knight comes there. He's also opening up the f-file for the f-pawn to advance, so bishop g5 is a standard idea in this line. White goes a4. He wants to undermine the weaknesses of Black's pawns on the queen side and get the rook into the game. With a5, Black prevents the advance of the b-pawn to b4. White finishes his development, and Black puts the rook on b8, where he wants to put the pressure on the b-pawn. He is no longer protecting the a5 pawn with the rook, but as we'll see in this game, his idea is to use to later use this bishop and possibly go back to d8 and protect the pawn from d8, which is going to be quite reliable. White defends the pawn. Black prepares f5, which happens now. And this is a very common position in the Sveshnikov. Usually White here goes knight c to e3, and then Black has a choice between bishop back, between bishop to e6 and bishop to g6. Instead, in the games, White played queen to e2, which is a little bit slower, I suppose. Black played queen to d7. It's not necessary to play queen d7, but with this move he frees up the d8 square for the bishop. So knight c to e3, he plays bishop to e6. The idea of this move is to put pressure on d5, one of the main ideas in the Sveshnikov. And now White goes rook to d1. This improves the control over the d file, but of course it does weaken the f2 square, and as we'll see, White will later try to exploit that. Black will try to exploit that. The bishop comes to d8 to protect the pawn, and maybe it will later swing to b6 and put pressure on the f2, but that's less likely because there's always this knight on d5 here. So with rook a2, White defends f2 for the future. Black increases the pressure on the f file and prepares to activate the queen. He also increases the pressure on d5. d5 is the key square in the Sveshnikov, and it's very important for Black to fight for it. So here White has an idea. His knights right now are controlling the same set of squares, so they could be called superfluous. And White would want to transfer the knight from e3 to e4, well, to control more squares, to put pressure on d6. But if he goes immediately with knight to f1, then he will no longer sufficiently control d5, and Black can try to use it by playing knight to e7. Let's say takes, and now if all the pieces get exchanged, then there's we get a position where Black's weakness is actually well defended, but he has pretty good pressure on the pawn on b3, which also becomes a weakness now. And if, say, White goes queen to c4, after this, it's a knight d2, he can even advance with d5. and this will be fine for black. So Geller does not want to allow this, and he first plays queen to d3, and later he plans to transfer the knight. But this gives black some time to create counterplay. So Sveshnikov transfers more pieces to the queen side, to the king side, sorry. White carries on with his maneuver, and here black starts to activate his pieces. So he goes e4. The idea is to give the square for the knight on e5. Of course, white cannot take it. Well, he could take it, but he would then lose the rook and would get some unclear position. So instead, Geller retreats in a way so that he still protects the rook on d1 from the attack of the queen. And after bishop to h4, now finally black has materialized his pressure on f2. He does threaten to capture right now. So white has to defend with knight to g3. This also counterattacks the queen, so black trades. And this structure with the pawns like this, it always gives black the motivation for transferring the knight to g4. And it will be hard to get rid of that knight because there's no longer a pawn on the h file. So it can't advance to h3 anymore. So now this is a standard idea. So black, of course, carries on with that. White counterattacks. Now both the queen and the bishop are hanging. So Sveshnikov had to anticipate that, and he sacrifices the exchange. But he gets a very strong attack in exchange for the exchange. Here, if black goes knight to g4, then white can just take, and the attack here is not that dangerous. The king just escapes, and white is ahead by a rook. So instead, Sveshnikov goes knight to f3, and this should be enough to give him sufficient attack for at least a draw. So he has to take, and again, if black say captures here, then the bishop would fall, and there's actually not a good square for a queen to check from, so this wouldn't be too good. So instead he first takes on c4, and later he threatens to capture on f3, even though he's down the rook for the moment. So white could take on c4, take back on c4, but then after e takes f3, black has a strong attack here, just enough for a draw. So instead, Geller destroys the pawn on e4, which was threatening to come to f3. And now the complications continue. The black bishop is under attack, but he takes on b3, and now the rooks are being attacked. So black's attack on the king side has kind of slowed down, it's almost over, but the complications still continue, and in time trouble the game becomes quite dramatic. So white's rooks are attacked, he counterattacks with a pin, so now taking on a2 is not possible because the rook on b8 is hanging. White also seems to have secured his king side for the moment. These pawns are giving pretty good protection, but black has one more counter shot. Now this hits the queen. Now if the queen just retreats, then the rook would fall and black would be up a piece. So Geller has another counter shot. He goes rook to a5. Now of course if the queen takes, then the rook falls and white's ahead by exchange. So he can't take on a5 either, so he throws another counterattack with d5. Now that hits the queen, and the queen has to go somewhere, and black still has some activity against the king. So here Geller could have gone for a draw by exchanging the queen for a rook and the bishop, and this would probably be a draw because black could just get a draw here with the perpetual check. Instead, he, in time trouble, had a complete hallucination, and he decided to increase the pressure on the e file and exploit the pin on this pawn. Pretty much exploit the pin on everything. and he went rook to e1. And now the idea is, I guess, if the rook takes, well, then he can go rook check, and when rook comes back, he's just gonna give the back rank checkmate. So he had a total hallucination that this will just work like that, because the queen can also not be taken like this, of course, because then the other pin comes into play. But what he missed was that black can play a check, and after this check the game is over, because he now, if the king retreats, then he will just take with a pawn because the pin is no longer in place, and if he takes, which is pretty much the only reasonable move, then black is just up a piece, because he takes here with check, and then also after the king retreats, then the pawn takes and the king has an escape square, and this is just completely winning for black. So after queen g6, white resigned. A very dramatic game in time trouble, but the key ideas that black showed in this game are that he can, well, first of all, defend the weakness on a5 very effectively from d8, and he can also create some solid threats on the king side against the white king. And even though the knight on d5 is strong, black can sort of play around that knight and not necessarily have to challenge it directly. Instead, with moves like pawn to e4, just transfer his pieces to the king side and still attack the white king. So a very interesting game by the man himself, in which he showed a lot of typical ideas for the Sveshnikov.